One of the things I want to do, I'm going to obviously be talking about the first people of Jekyll Island. And I'm going to have my lovely assistant, who is also my wife, pass out some black drink. And this is a beverage that was consumed by Native Americans. And I want you to get in the spirit of what it would have been like to be a Native American on Jekyll Island, perhaps as early as 30,000 years ago, maybe just 800 years ago. This is an illustration of preparation of black drink. It was an important ceremonial beverage. We know from the historic contact period that this was consumed primarily by men, although most of the Native Americans also allowed women, had a very different approach towards divisional labor and those sort of things. But they consumed this beverage as part of a ceremonial cleansing operation before going into council. So if you had important decisions to be made that were going to affect your population, they'd drink enough of this that it would clean them out at both ends. Okay, I'll pass around what it looks like in its slightly toasted form. So just pass that around. It's called Ilex vomitoria is its formal name. Get the last part of that. But it's also known as Cassina holly. You probably have these plants as a landscape plant in your yard, perhaps. Yupon holly is another name for it. There's tons of it growing on Jekyll Island. So they would collect these leaves and toast them and continually drank this. And in fact, when the Spanish came here, it was one of their primary beverages as well. If you tasted it, it's pretty terrible. Yes. And it's not sweetened, and there really were no sweeteners for Native Americans here on Jekyll Island until honeybees were introduced, primarily by Europeans. So they really didn't have a mechanism to improve its flavor. But in any case, I guess if you were desperate enough, this was better than perhaps some of the water you had to consume. And when it was consumed in ceremonial situations, they typically would use a shell cup made from a shell such as this, the Buzicon conch. They take the center out of it. It's a large example. So now hopefully you're getting in the spirit of being a Native American here on Jekyll Island. So one of the things that archaeologists have to do in order to study people in the past, as you know, archaeologists in the prehistoric era don't have the advantage of written records. So we have to look at the artifacts, the sites, the landscape of what the past people who lived here left behind. And then we have to sort of organize that. You can't just deal with it without some sense of organization. So archaeologists have used the concept of evolution, cultural evolution, both gradualism and punctuated equilibrium. Gradualism is kind of how we see things slowly changing over time. And if you look at the evolution of cultures, they hopefully improve over time. As we know, though, they do take dips. We may be in a dip right now. And punctuated equilibrium is basically a concept that you stay the same. Let's say you're one of the finches that Darwin found on the islands. All right, environmental pressures build on you as a finch. They continue to build, and one or two things are going to happen. You're either going to change to adapt, or you're going to die. And so the idea of punctuated equilibrium is that you stay at a sort of constant state, and then when the stresses get too great, you got to go one way or the other way. And generally with cultures, they would improve or find solutions to their problems. So environmental change and adaptation are reflected in the archaeological record. They're important components to help us understand how that change takes place. What we have to do, and I don't have a laser pointer, so we'll go low tech, is provide some organization as we look back in time. So generally we have these categories. Paleo-Indian, 14,000 to 10,000 years ago, is kind of the more generally recognized time period, although there's some evidence that it could go back as early as 30,000 years ago. Time period we call archaic, 10,000 to 3,000 years ago. Woodland, 2,500 to 1,000 years ago, and Mississippian about 1,000 years ago, up to the time of historic contact. So in archaeology, how do we come up and how do we study the native people? Well, we do surveys to find out where these sites are. We do testing to find out something about those sites, full-scale excavations of certain sites, and all based on a research design, some idea of what are the problems and questions we're trying to answer. And some of the data we look at are soil strata. There's not really, this is an excavation unit. You can see big pits in here, some stratification. And then we look at features. These pits would be considered features. It's a unique bit of activity that went on and left something in the soil. So it could be a trash pit from last night's dinner. It could be the remains of the rotted wood from a wooden post that supported your structure, or it might be a barrel well if you're in St. Augustine. And in fact, this was, I'm kind of tooting my own little excavation here just because we had a lot of fun doing it. But there I am in the bottom of a hole about 12 foot deep. We were trying to fight the tide. And this was the first complete wooden barrel removed from a Spanish barrel well that's dated to about 1676 or thereabouts in St. Augustine. But we look at context, artifacts. We study zooarchaeology, which are the animal remains, whether they're food or domesticated animals, bioarchaeology. So we look at the plant remains that are left from pollen, and sometimes in wet environments. Excuse me, we actually find remains of plants, seeds, carbonized seeds, and then specialized analysis, which is a really growing area in archaeology currently. But let's go back and look at some of these people. So the Paleo-Indians, our first group, these are what their spear points look like. It's kind of the classic definition of Paleo-Indians. One of the things that in this image, these people were here when we don't know how early they populated this area. Some evidence suggests that it might have been up to 30,000 years ago. There are sites in South America, some sea oats in Mexico, the sinkholes in Mexico, where they're finding some very early human remains. And let's see, okay. And then, I don't know if you've seen this, but these are footprints found in White Sands National Monument. They believe those date to about 22,000 years ago. Wow. So we're getting increasing evidence that humans had made it into North America much earlier than 10 to 14,000 years ago, which was kind of the ongoing long-term explanation. Now, we always talk about, this ice-free corridor. There's growing evidence that a lot of the influx of humans into North America and into the Americas was probably along the coast. These were maritime adapted people that knew how to run canoes, and that they got into this area by coming along the coast. And so Jekyll Island has the potential for people to be here 12 to 14, maybe even longer years ago that would have been in this area. Although it wouldn't have been Jekyll Island, it wouldn't have been an island at all. Much drier environment, sea level. So we're obviously up in this corner. I couldn't find a good sea level map for Georgia, for the Georgia coast, but about 10,000 years ago, here's the coastline. So up to 50 miles further out. So this environment would have been freshwater, riverine. This would have been probably a small elevation within a freshwater marsh kind of environment. Significantly different environment than what we're accustomed to. Early on in the Paleo-Indian period, megafauna were in this area, so giant ground sloths. You could be walking home and the saber-toothed tiger might cross your path. So they were hunting mammoth and mastodons during this period. And that's why you see these kind of large projectile points. And one of the things that is a pretty major bias in archaeology, it's going away slowly, is that we focus on man the hunter, whereas most of the food came from woman the gatherer. So, you could go out and try to kill a large beast, or even in later times a deer, and that would provide a good bit of meat for a period of time. But for daily sustenance, most of the foods that were being acquired were going to be gathered foods or trapped, smaller animals, aquatic resource, marine resources, really important. That would have been the case here in Jekyll Island. In this instance, they were probably, during this time period, on Jekyll exploiting freshwater fish, turtles, and other freshwater species because the coastline would have been so much further out. Most of the evidence we find on Jekyll, we don't have any evidence of Paleo-Indian occupation. If we did, it'd be very deeply buried or underwater. And typically the evidence that we find are flakes from stone tools. The early archaic period. So we're up to about 10,000 years ago. The megafauna becoming extinct. The environment's getting significantly wetter. Sea level is rising, so that ocean is now getting closer and closer to Jekyll. Gathering, hunting, and fishing are still the primary ways you make a living and you sustain yourself. Small nomadic bands, egalitarian-based society, so everybody's pretty much equal. Probably if you're a good hunter, you got a little extra credit. If you were a good gatherer, the same thing. Spear points, bone tools, shell tools, a lot of scraping and cutting tools that we find archaeologically used for processing plants and hides. The Middle Archaic period, again, we get this type of change in environment. It's again, the sea level is continuing to rise. Still, many of these archaeological sites, if you were to find them, would be underwater. So we don't get a lot of evidence of archaic sites here on Jekyll, although there are some stone points that are found along the shell rakes that have washed up from underwater sites off of Jekyll. Population's growing. These people are moving around with the resources. So if you're gathering hickory nuts and you gather all there are to be gathered, it's time to move on. So these people seasonally move through different areas, adapted, particularly in this time period and later, specific adaptations to specific environments. So the people in Georgia, North Georgia, whole different adaptation than you'd have here on the coast. So population is growing, but still moving. The settlements are getting somewhat larger. So perhaps larger than 2 or 3 families. You're probably getting extended families that are living together in settlements and moving. They're beginning to exploit deer, small game, shellfish, shrimp, roots, seeds, nuts, and greens. And in fact, archaeologically, believe it or not, in the zooarchaeological recovery, they find shrimp mandibles in some of the soil. Kind of hard to believe, but these shrimp mandibles, give us an idea of expanding that sense of what these people were consuming, how they were making a living. Stone tools become smaller over time. These are kind of typical of what you'd see stemmed archaic points. In this environment in Jekyll, a lot of use of marine shells. So you can see here there's 2 holes in this conch shell. Well, you can put a handle through there, turn that into a hoe, or if you don't like your neighbor, you can whack them over the head with it. These are probably used for scraping, chisel type tools, again, mostly probably for woodworking. One of the things we have a hard time in archaeology is understanding all of the materials that these people use that have rotted away. So they're processing deer hides, they're decorating things, they're working wood, all these things that we don't see, but we do see some of the tools that were used. Now, this is, you can't really see it too well. Well, wrong one. There you go. Okay, well that looks like a rock, right? But it's got a hole in the top of it. It goes all the way through to the bottom. So people during this time period, how did they make their living as far as hunting? And the tool that they used was the atlatl. So this is probably a fairly lightweight spear. They would have been significantly heavier duty. And the idea with this little device, if I can remember how to use it properly, is that it had a hook on this end that fit into the spear. It might have had a stone, this one's broken off at the end obviously, a stone projectile point on the end. A lot of times the spears might have also had a section of bone that the projectile point was in that was glued onto the end of the shaft. So if the spear landed in the animal, the point would stay in, you could recover the shaft and maybe fasten another point onto it and get back into business. But you would hold this, and what this does when you throw it, it extends the time that you can propel this projectile. Gives you tremendous range, power, and force, and amplifies that. So that was, as far as hunting activities, that the atlatl and the spear were really the primary hunting tools for these people through the Archaic period. Let's see, oh, I lost my pointer. Okay, so again, these folks are adapting to their environment. We start to see evidence of baskets and weaving found. There's a site that is in Florida down near Cape Canaveral, Melbourne area, the Wendover site. It's 7,000 years old. In that site, my major professor, Dr. Dorn, was the principal investigator for that site. And it's a pond that has human burials in it. The burials were wrapped in cloth and pinned to the bottom of this pond as the burial process. Contained within a number of these burials were very intricately woven bags. They were wrapped in a fabric material to bury them. And so we know from that, at least 7,000 years ago, human beings were engaging in weaving and basket making. One of the, a little interesting aside about Wendover is I happened to be with Dr. Dorn and another one of Dr. Daly, one of my other professors at FSU when I was in graduate school. We drove down to the site. This guy pulls up in a pickup truck and he pulls out some pickle barrel or 5-gallon pickle containers that he got at McDonald's. And he's got 3 of them on the back tailgate of his truck. And they're filled with water, and inside he goes out and pulls out a skull. So there were 6 of them on the back of his truck. So he takes it out and he goes, "We're not quite sure what's going on with these." And he hands one. Dr. Daly was a physical anthropologist, kind of a crazy Canadian guy. And so he takes a skull and he jostles it around and he hears something sloshing around inside. So he looks over at Dr. Dorn and goes, they're both kind of thinking, what do we got here? So he flips it over, pulls out his penknife, and he kind of jostles whatever's inside down to the foramen magnum, the larger hole where your cervical column goes in. And he scrapes out something on his penknife, rubs it between his fingers, he sniffs it, and I think he even tasted it. And he said, "No, it couldn't be," and put it back. So they surmised, oh, it's probably just mud that's accumulated inside the crania. Turns out it was human brain material, 7,000 years old. They recovered so much of it from the burials that they excavated that I know they froze a lot of it, did some DNA analysis on what they could, but it was kind of a spectacular find because it was in a wet environment. Now here on Jekyll, we have potential for wet environment finds here as well, because as you know, there's freshwater ponded areas and other things, and I'll show you a slide of kind of an interesting geological formation here on Jekyll in just a minute. Okay, y'all feeling Native American yet? Is that tea kicked in? All right, late Archaic, and archaeologists, when we get to defining things, get kind of boring, and I've come to find out that how you get famous in archaeology is you make up something new. So everybody else, you have to name it something else. You have to, define its area that it's found in, and then you publish like crazy about it, and you hopefully get tenure. So sea level rises in the late Archaic, less fresh water, more salt water. The estuary system develops around Jekyll, so now we've got brackish water up in here, a lot more diversity in terms of the animal species, increased social stratification, craft specialization. Chiefdoms develop with ascribed status, so instead of having to earn your place in society, now you can just get born into it. Larger settlements with control over smaller villages. So we're seeing political control and political systems developing, less nomadic, more specialized to environments. So these people are moving around somewhat still, but probably only within certain environmental zones. Pottery is invented. We don't think much about pottery because, you go to Pottery Barn or wherever and you buy all you want, and, we use it for flower pots. But if you didn't have ceramics and you had to cook dinner, how are you going to cook something over an open fire other than roasting it and, actually produce a stew or boil some vegetables or, whatever else you want to make? Well, you can do it in baskets. You can make waterproof baskets. You can seal them up with grease. Eventually, they're going to burn through. So ceramics, about 4,000 years ago, and in fact, in the area here in Jekyll is some of the earliest ceramics were produced here. In Florida, we call them Orange period ceramics. Up here, they call them Stallings Island. Again, go back to that thing that if you can name it and make it separate, you get tenure. They're basically exactly the same. I'll pass this piece around. What's interesting is if you look at the back, you'll see how it kind of looks eroded. It has fiber temper. Temper is material you add to clay to help hold it together or help make it stronger when you fire it. A lot of times it's sand or shell. In this case, they were mixing either Spanish moss or other fibers into the clay to help hold it together when they made the pots. And we think they were probably all coil built. You probably know how that process works. And this is a rim shirt. It's got a nice flat rim on it. And you can look at the slight bend in this. It's part of probably a pretty big pot. So I do need these back at the end. So ceramics are invented, and one of the things that archaeologists do with ceramics is we spend a heck of a lot of time looking at them because it's one of those artifacts that doesn't go away. You lose it, you break it, you bury it. It's used for utilitarian purposes. It's used to make ceremonial objects. So we learn a lot from ceramics. We look at the design. It's a plastic medium. So you can put any kind of design you want on it. That one has inscribed lines. I've seen some, you can pinch it, where you can still see the fingerprints of whoever made the pot are still in the clay after it's been fired. And so we can look at that and look at how people moved around because groups of people made certain kinds of pottery with certain designs. So by studying that, we can tell who was where, and it helps us kind of organize how these people were relating to each other and also to define trade routes. So in the late Archaic, we have quite a bit of trade going on. One of the things that really happens in the late Archaic is it's a fluorescence of culture. So new developments come in like ceramics. We see mound building ceremonial mounds, monuments basically to the dead, and also for ceremonies to be held on. When we have people who are in a stratified society with ascribed status, those important people get to live on top of mounds so they can look down on the rest of us. Okay, we still kind of do that. If you got a big fancy house, you got a little more status than the guy that's in the trailer down the road. So it's the same idea. Again, there's still hunting and gathering. We see evidence of long-distance trading networks for exotic goods. And plant domestication starts. So that's an important component as well. One of the things that is interesting about hunting and gathering societies is that those are the folks who had the most free time. So you think you got a lot of free time when you start doing agriculture, that goes out the window. You got to tend to the plants, you start raising animals, you got to tend to the animals. Next thing you know, the animals are living close to you. Next thing you know, you're catching diseases from the animals. So even though it allowed for tremendous population growth as domestication of plants and animals exists, there's a downside to that equation as well. These are called atlatl weights. We don't have any here, but the way these worked, and these are exotic imported materials, they've been found along the coast here in burial mounds with individuals, is, got the wrong pointer. Those stone weights would have been fastened onto this shaft, okay? So it would have sat in there sort of like that. And the idea was, when you threw that spear, that weight would slide all the way down to that end and add some extra, you got some extra momentum, some extra power, some extra weight, plus they look really cool. I mean, you know, who wouldn't want to be strutting around the village, you know, with your atlatl over your shoulder with one of those babies hanging off? So, again, you know, these folks were living here on Jekyll Island. Late Archaic, we do start to see some evidence on Jekyll Island. And with that fluorescence that I talked about, we start to see, as I mentioned, mound construction. This is a site over in northern Louisiana. Doesn't seem like it has a darn thing to do with Jekyll Island, but you can see that it's an intricate, involved pattern of raised ridges, mounds, platform mounds. This is an archaic, late Archaic period site, and we have found artifacts. These people, it's called Poverty Point. They produce these little odd ceramic objects which probably predated ceramic production that look like this. They're blobs of clay in very specific shapes. We found 3 or 4 of these on Jekyll. What are they doing coming from Louisiana? Who are these people? How are they communicating across from Jekyll Island to northeast Louisiana? And what does that trade look like? What are those influences that are coming here to coastal Georgia from those people? Now, we do have one of the other interesting features are shell rings. You may have heard about them. There's a couple on St. Simon's Island. Archaeology was, again, sort of going back to how archaeologists function, was a pretty male-dominated, you know, industry. So everything was initially all about the hunters and the hunters. You know, man and a spear killing the big animal. And those sites that were initially found, people really focused on the stone tools and thought, oh, they all live inland where the stone is. So if you're in Georgia, you're going to be up in the Piedmont where this material is available. If you're in Florida, you're going to be in Ocala because that's where this kind of material comes from. And you're not going to live on the coast. So they never looked on the coast for sites. And the funny thing is, if you look at a map of where sites are found in any state in the nation, they're around universities. Who would have thought? You know, those Native Americans knew where to live, right? They went to Athens. So, you know, where the professors were and the students is where they found the sites. But these shell rings developed in the late Archaic. We don't know their function. This is the one over on Sapelo Island. It's about 15 foot tall. That's a lot of shell. And the diameter of these things is huge. As you can see, this is what structures would have looked like inside. We really don't, everybody speculates that they're ceremonial of some kind. We don't really know. But they develop in the late Archaic, as do mounds. They disappear at the end of the late Archaic, as do mounds. They go away. People stop making them. Now remember, these people are hunting and gathering. In order to build a mound, what do you need? A whole lot of people, a bunch of baskets, and they got to dig up all that dirt and move it by hand and pile it up. So you don't do that in a weekend with 2 guys. So we have a social condition in the late Archaic where there's obviously a hierarchy. There's a surplus of labor. These people are getting enough food they could probably have 100 or 200 people who spent whatever time it took just moving dirt all day to create these ceremonial mounds. So we have a society that's so well adapted to its environment that it has surplus labor. The other good thing to do if you're a chief and you got a bunch of people with free time on their hands, don't let them have free time, because they're going to figure out how to get rid of you. Okay? They're going to want your position. So you keep them busy building things through religious belief systems, political systems, to keep them occupied and keep them from hunting you down one day and taking your power away from you. So as I mentioned, exotic goods like these atlatl weights, these are for, well, at least 3 projectile points and probably a knife that were found here on Jekyll Island. A visitor found them, turned them in, and let me remind you, collecting artifacts on Jekyll Island is illegal. Using metal detectors is illegal. Looting sites is illegal. But this was some of the earliest evidence we had of archaic occupation, probably middle to late archaic on Jekyll. Also, during a hurricane that came in, Matthew I think it was, we found evidence of an archaic site. It had washed down on the beach up in the north end. We had a soapstone bowl fragment, a lot of that kind of Orange period or Stallings Island fiber-tempered pottery. And no projectile points, but very clear indications that we had a late archaic site right there along the beach. It was under about 8 to 10 foot of sand. These are just examples of what those whole pots would have looked like. So the late archaic is really a pretty special time period. It's when we first see occupation, good evidence of occupation here on Jekyll. And it was an interesting time for these people. As I mentioned before about evolution, as we see really social, political, and economic development going on up until the late archaic. Oh, here we go. I should have put that slide up sooner. So here's the location where we found some of the archaic material that had washed out behind the new berm that was put up. Again, now, fortunately, it's buried under a lot of sand, so it's well protected for the future. There's sort of a larger image of those artifacts. Also, during some of the high tides and those storm events here on Jekyll, this kind of material turns up on the beach. As you can see, how many of you have seen things like this out on the beach? All right, tree roots, what are they doing on the beach? So obviously, we had a much more forested environment. This is really the material that underlies Jekyll, Pleistocene-type deposits. This is where you're going to find the archaic and maybe the Paleo-Indian. This is the soil that was here before all the sand came in, when sea level rose and you had dune formations beginning to form. So back when it was a kind of a freshwater environment, and when I walked over this, you could literally see burnt pieces of wood and other vegetation evidence in that deposit. So that's likely why these artifacts were found, because she found them in one of these types of deposit areas that were exposed during a storm event here on Jekyll. Okay, the woodlands period. What happens here? Mounds go away, shell rings go away. Something happens. So I think what we really have going on is that these hunters and gatherers overexploited their environment, their population grew too much, society kind of fell apart. They took a step backwards. We don't like to think that socially we could go backwards, but I believe it happened between the late archaic and the woodland period. So woodlands, again, we see really significant kind of environmental change. I think in the late archaic, we had significant enough sea level rise. We see evidence on some coastal sites where that whole environment changed from freshwater species to marine clams and oyster shells. Archaeologists get excited about oysters and clams and other things that people throw away. So we have mounds, and the large shell rings all disappear. Ceramic production improves, ceremonialism continues. We look and see a lot more changes in design, temper material in the ceramics, which give us an idea of some cultural differences between these people. Bows and arrows are invented. So atlatl goes away, and this tool comes into production and is extremely effective. But it's a much more effective tool in a wooded environment. So if you're hunting today for some of those nice deer that wander around Jekyll, you know, this would be a little problematic. You wouldn't have enough open space. But the bow and arrow works quite well. Villages become larger, life becomes much more sedentary, plant domestication improves, and supplements the gathering, hunting, and fishing, particularly in this coastal environment. The resources were so rich here, and the soil and wasn't really all that great for corn agriculture, corn, bean, and squash. So they grew some of it and probably traded for a good bit of it to the inland folks. But, you know, instead of having to go out and hunt a deer, and this is another little bias, is that where archaeologists focus on all this hunting activity, it's pretty easy to sneak up on the wily oyster. And you usually don't get bit back. You might get your foot cut, but a clam and an oyster are not going to do you a whole lot of damage. But they're really great to eat, and Native American people, particularly here in this maritime environment, ate them all the time, along with a lot of fish, a lot of small game. Manatees were probably on the menu. Sea turtle certainly was probably a seasonal delight. They showed up in numbers on the beach and were pretty easy to get a hold of. Corn gets introduced. Swidden horticulture, this is slash and burn. So, you know, you're clearing small areas and planting them with using fire. Trade, warfare is really pretty hot and heavy during this time period. A lot more social stratification. We notice that when we find villages that are fortified, so obviously you got a reason to be scared of your neighbor. I'm going to pass around 3 of these projectile points. These are kind of from the late Archaic. That's the broken one.
Okay.
Now imagine you as a Native American having to make this out of a block of rock.
Wow.
This is chert. These are all from Florida. And so you would use a stone to kind of whittle this down to a certain shape, and then begin to use manatee bones, because they're solid, and make great, what are called hammer stones, to knock off flakes. This one, probably the end broke and they reworked it to make it more like a little drill or to engraver. And then this one is kind of unique. You can see it's a different color. It's got a much better edge over here. You can look and see some real fine touching. They probably used a little bit of deer bone to chip off these edges. But this one's kind of pink colored. So they figured out how they can improve stone by heating it up. This is called thermally altered chert, and it turns this kind of rosy pink color if you heat it up over a slow period of time. Makes it a little bit more glassy, makes it a little more waxy on the surface, and it makes a better tool and you can chip it better. So these folks understood in their environment, developed pretty interesting technologies, things that we need scientists to figure out as to how they accomplish these tasks. Woodland kinds of artifacts. So you can see ceramics really take off. And you get these decorative ceramic pieces. This has a hollow bottom, so it was probably mounted on some type of post. Might have even had something burning inside. You know, this effigy vessel with these cutouts. The projectile points get smaller because you're using arrows. A lot of modification of bone, working of shell. These ceramics, here's an example of a pot, some of the domesticated types of plants. And you can see that it has a stamp design in it. They would have used carved paddles to make those stamps. And in fact, the logo for the Mosaic Museum is based on a piece of stamped pottery that was found here on Jekyll. So that's where that design comes from on the mosaic. Anybody want more tea, by the way? Okay, Mississippian period. This is our last kind of cultural era, about 1,000 years ago up to historic contact in the 16th century. Large villages, ceremonial centers, mound building takes off. These people were highly sophisticated. They were just like Europeans, they just didn't have boats that could go across the Atlantic. But pretty much everything else they had. Now, draft animals, they didn't have horses. Those come in with the Spanish because they had gone extinct. But very sophisticated, highly developed social organizations, religion, a lot of craft specialization, people who did nothing but make ceramics. You know, craftsmen were obviously part of the deal. Soldiers, because warfare is still going on. Specialized farmers, chiefdom societies. We see in the historic record that both males and females could be leaders of chiefdoms. So it wasn't exclusively a male activity. They also, we know from the historic period references that they were matrilineal. They traced descent through the female line. So you inherited from your uncle. And they generally had, so it was matrilineal, and they had what we call moieties. They were groups. Society was really broken up into two groups, like the Red Stick and the White Stick Creeks, same sort of thing. Now we're projecting some of this back from the historic documents, but it's very likely that these traditions of recognizing descent and organizing societies probably had a long-standing tradition in terms of the time period. Anybody asleep yet? Usually there's a couple people asleep by now. But I mentioned trade. You know, copper was coming into this area from up in Michigan, native copper, traded perhaps for worked shell that was being sent north in exchange. These are illustrations, kind of our best illustrations of what native life would have looked like in this vicinity during historic contact. These are Lemoyne illustrations. Lemoyne was a French artist that accompanied Laudonnière and Ribaud when they set up Fort Caroline down on the May or St. John's River, although there's some controversy about that. The actual Fort Caroline has never been found. But he did these drawings. The drawings were lost, but a wood carver and publisher, DeBry, got a look at them and made his own woodcuts from those images and then printed them and published them. So that's why we have them now. But as you can see, a lot of things aren't really terribly accurate. There's some European kind of imagery going on that probably isn't terribly accurate in terms of its description of Native American life, but it's our best thing that we have going in terms of what that would have been like. Canoes. Think of Jekyll Island now, the way to get here, you paddled, rode the tides, yeah.
I remember you made that canoe out there.
Yes, that's my canoe.
And you
Took a lot of beer. Oh, I cheated. There was a chainsaw involved, there were charcoal briquettes. Debbie will tell you I was sitting out out in front of the garage, you know, tending the fire in the canoe while consuming beer. So it wasn't as hard as it would have been for Native Americans. One of the things I did learn, though, is or at least I surmise, it may or may not be true, but the shape of the canoe, and you can tell me if you think I'm full of hooey or not, and my drawing is pretty bad. But typically they have this kind of funny little tail on them where it's scooped out here. And then, you know, obviously you've got to have a curved front. Well, I got to thinking that if I'm looking at a pine tree in the woods and I got to take this thing down to make a canoe out of it, how am I going to do it? I'm not going to, you know, I could be there for 100 years with that sharpened shell trying to do it. Well, if I light it on fire, it's going to burn and fall over. But what's going to happen is I'm going to burn this side, and part of it's probably not going to get burnt. And I think this is where the fire was when this thing was vertical. And then you got the top and all the tree limbs, so you start another fire to burn the other end of it up, and you inherently get that other curve. But almost almost all of the Native American canoes that are found, and even the ones the Seminoles continue to use, frequently have that kind of little platform tail. And that's my theory, and I'm sticking to it. But you can see, agriculture, obviously, and we know from the historic documents that these people had some pretty amazing clothing. Bird feathers, dyed. They were tattooed pretty heavily. Men with the top knot hair, kind of really, of the period right now, actually. Yeah. And so, a pretty advanced society, and very much maritime adapted along these coastlines. These people knew how to exploit and acquire resources from the marine environment. And they were here on Jekyll Island. These are generally referred to as people who were Timucuan speakers. We grouped them together primarily by language. Macambo, there are different groups. There's the Sachariwa, the Agua Dulce. These are all kind of names that came down from the Spanish when they first came here. Interacted with these people, would meet the chief or the local headman for an area, and that group might call, the Spanish referred to, the freshwater Indians in one location. And so we can identify through the historical records and then go back in the archaeological records and find evidence that helps us define where these different groups lived along the coast and inland. The Utinas were in around Gainesville in Florida. But they were a pretty large group of people, had a generally common language that they shared, and were here at the time of European contact. And that's one of the things that's kind of difficult with these folks in terms of the projection through history, is they were all gone by 1764, an extinct group of people. Both diseased, they were enslaved to build the Castillo de San Marcos, and warfare between themselves as well. So some more specific things to kind of bring us back home to Jekyll Island is there are about 61 sites on Jekyll, archaeological sites. Remind you again, it's illegal to dig in any of those, metal detect or collect artifacts from Jekyll. If you do find things, turn them in to people like Tom. He knows what to do. Andrea will take care of them. She's a professional archaeologist, can help identify them and then catalog them and make sure they add to our understanding. And responsible people help protect sites. One of the things about archaeological sites, unlike turtles, you can't put a fence up around their nest and hope that they'll reproduce and come back next year. Once you lose a site or a part of a site, it's gone forever. Even the act of archaeology destroys the resource that we're trying to study. So no Paleo-Indian sites, archaic sites are under the sand dunes and underwater. Those Poverty Point objects were found. In fact, you can see them on display here at the Mosaic Museum. We do get some archaic artifacts that wash up in the shell rakes from submerged, is underneath that somewhere. And most sites here on Jekyll are of the Woodland or Mississippian period. We don't get evidence of those really big ceremonial sites on Jekyll. This was the boondocks for Native Americans. Great place to live, plenty to eat, but we don't see these. St. Simon's Island probably has a significantly larger population and more evidence of Native American occupation. Most of the sites here on Jekyll are shell middens. This is what a shell midden looks like. You all have probably seen these around Jekyll. There's a little piece of Native American pottery that's out at Horton House. So places that we think of as historic sites are actually prehistoric sites. Every time I find a prehistoric site, if I stand there and look around, I can pretty much tell myself, hey, I'd like to live here. This looks like a pretty nice spot. Because what we look for as humans and the resources for where we want to live hasn't changed a whole lot. So if you see shells, unless the landscaping people have brought them in and spread them around, it's probably a Native American site. But colonial folks ate oysters and clams like crazy as well, so they continued to add to those middens. And midden is just a term for those shell deposits. I didn't do it. I guess the spirits are against me tonight. Let me oh, you know what? I might have had a slide in there that was hidden or something. It was probably, I did this on an Apple computer and it doesn't always translate that well. Come on, one more. Oh, pointed at the right thing, Bruce. Okay. All right, so you thought you saw it. Could be. So, who knows where Indian Mound is? Guess what's on Indian Mound? An Indian Mound. It's a real Indian Mound. Human burials have been found associated with that mound, so it was a burial mound. It's part of a larger site that extends all over the historic district. And in fact, as you walk out today, if you look across the road, that's what this is a shot of. When they are digging this ditch to improve the drainage back there, I was out monitoring and identified a number of little deposits of shell midden with lots of conch shells. And what they look like are probably individual little homes that were there, or shelters that were used. And the remains that were found in the ground were the things that were part of the food that was consumed while they lived in those little sites. A lot of times we focus on these big shell middens and think, man, all the good stuff's got to be in the big deposit, right? Well, it's pretty confused. There's all kinds of shell thrown in there. It's difficult to excavate. It's hard to find features. When you find them in an area where there's nothing else around, but you get these isolated features, you can start to identify things like individual structures. And on the back of this, the historic district has a huge shell midden in it. And on the back perimeter of it are where we have evidence of some of these individual, probably homes that were lived in. We don't know the time period. Out on the causeway as you come in, under the visitor center, another burial mound, not there anymore. There's a building on top of it. Long ago it was taken out, but there's a large site there. Again, we don't really know anything about it. Out by the FAA tower area, there's 2 sites out in that area. Those are woodland period. In the historic district, I mentioned that. That's the west side. Again, Horton House, you go out there, there's both the historic shell midden and a prehistoric shell midden there. One of the threats for it is that it's washing away. Around the Dairy Queen area, there's a scatter of shell middens. Particularly if you ride in some of the trails, you might see some shell along the sides of the trails. And a lot of those are sites that we don't know much about at this point. But as I mentioned before, once they're disturbed, they're lost forever. And so we need to protect them. When we do have to do something, we should mitigate the impacts. If we're going to build something, we need to go in there and do the research first, find out what we have. But the sites here on Jekyll are at most at risk right now, primarily from erosion, some from construction, landscaping activities. It sounds kind of silly, but if you go into the historic district or in around a known archaeological site and plant a tree, you got to dig a pretty big hole if it's a good-sized tree, and that's an adverse impact. And obviously, construction and land clearing. One of the difficult things with climate change and sea level rise is going to be erosion and protecting some of those sites. Difficult process. Decisions will have to be made about what's worth saving and what isn't, and whether or not we go in and do some research, dig what we can, learn what we can, and then say, okay, adios, it's going to wash away. We can't stop Mother Nature. So I think that's thank goodness, the last one. I don't know about you, I'm tired of talking.